All right, Andrew Kraft here now in the anchor chair, and you have been just watching this very, very newsy press conference between their President Trump and the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Just want to welcome all our viewers in. It's 5:30 here Mountain Time, 7:30 there in Washington, there in the East Room of the White House. And you heard so many of those questions specifically focusing on the Middle East, on the Israel-Hamas war, on the situation in the Gaza Strip, particularly President Trump offering up some, shall we say, new, creative, unorthodox ideas about what to do with the Gaza Strip and the Palestinians who hail from there once the war is all said and done here. Just to recap, the big headline out of it there, President Trump saying that the United States will have some type of role in what happens with the Gaza Strip. He said, quote, a long-term ownership position. Now, when he was asked whether or not that includes U.S. troops, he hedged, wouldn't commit fully there. So that is getting a lot of attention right now, not only in the room there in the White House, but online as well. It's getting a lot of attention for our friend, national security analyst and expert, and retired Marine intelligence officer Hal Kempfer, who joins me with a recap of what we all just listened to. Hal, good to see you here. And boy, there's a lot to get to. But the headline out of this all is that President Trump is proposing, and remember, he had not done this on the campaign trail. He had not done this in the last two and a half weeks now that he has been sworn in the White House, about a long-term role for the United States in rebuilding Gaza. And in addition to that, the Palestinians who live there right now and who've been displaced by the war going and living somewhere else. So essentially what President Trump is saying, Gaza without the Palestinians, but with the U.S. role here. What do you make of all this? Netanyahu responded to it by saying Trump is taking it to a much higher level. He said it would change history if that were the case. And then when he was asked on whether or not Trump believes in still the policy of the United States about a two-state solution, he didn't want to get into that. But if the United States were in Gaza, you wouldn't need a two-state solution, would you? So there's a lot to tease out here. Hal, your first thoughts?
Stunning. When he first said it at the press conference, I had to listen. I go, maybe he misspoke. What he meant to say was Israel, and he said the U.S. No. He said the U.S., and then he came down and really explained. Apparently, they have been talking about this extensively. It was very clear. I saw Bibi Netanyahu's physical reaction, and first I thought maybe he was caught off guard, that maybe he thought that President Trump had misspoken. He didn't correct him in his remarks, and then it became very clear. No, this is exactly what we're talking about, is that the U.S. would go in there and take, quote, an ownership position, unquote, with Gaza. In other words, it would become, I don't know how they would do this legally, but it looks like he's talking about Gaza would become a U.S. territory. This is stunning. I frankly, I have to go back to the end of World War II and World War I to find comparable situations where the U.S. stepped in and took over these areas far afield and made them U.S. territory. And in the Pacific, we did it after World War II. Countries are now independent, like Palau, Marshall Islands, Micronesia. Those are U.S. territories for a very long time. Okinawa in Japan was a U.S. territory for a very long time. These things did happen after World War II, but I've never seen anything put forward quite like this. And let's just say there's a lot of diplomacy, a lot of negotiation that has to happen, because you would have to have pretty much almost all the Arab leaders across the Middle East, not Iran, but you'd have to have certainly the King of Jordan. You'd have to have the President of Egypt would have to fervently agree. I don't see whereas the Gulf states could do this without having the 100% approval of the Gulf Cooperation Council, which includes Saudi Arabia. They would all have to weigh in. It is to say it's a bold proposal was to put it lightly.
Yeah.
I've just never seen anything like this. I have heard expressions over the years that if they could just figure out the political problem with Gaza, it could really become like they used to refer to Lebanon as the Paris of the Middle East or the
Sure.
Paris of the Mediterranean, that Gaza could become something comparable to, say, what Abu Dhabi or Dubai
Sure.
were at one time before they, at the early stages when they were developing. They said, look, it's a great location,
Yeah.
and President Trump is a real estate guy, so location, location, location's
Right.
a big deal.
That's what I was saying. I mean, is this his
Yeah.
real estate tycoon brain speaking now, as president of the United States yet again? Earlier today in the Oval Office, he said Palestinians have, quote, no alternative but to leave the Gaza Strip. He described it as a quote unquote demolition site. He questioned why they would want to stay. So, and he is still reiterating and reaffirming that these leaders in the Middle East, the King of Jordan, the leader of Egypt, have already signed off on his idea to relocate Palestinians outside of the Gaza Strip. Hal, they have not. And there was a joint letter over the weekend by several Arab nations essentially saying they will not take in Palestinian refugees, much like they have not throughout the duration of this entire conflict here. Is this Trump just being Trump by the more times you say it, maybe the likelihood or the reality of it actually happening goes up? But they haven't agreed to do that here. So if they haven't agreed, they being Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, and the like, they haven't agreed to take Palestinians and relocate them outside of the Gaza Strip. And the United States is going to come in and do what they will with the Gaza Strip. He was asked if U.S. troops will be deployed to take over Gaza. He said, we'll do what's necessary. We'll take it over and develop it here. There are some contradictions in these statements here. So do you think this will be a little more fully fleshed out now that this is out there in the ether?
Well, what I will say is I did hear him say something that maybe he was rephrasing that, where he kind of indicated that they weren't willing to accept them now, but he felt that they would. He kind of expressed his friendship, a close relationship with King of Jordan and the president of Egypt, and of course with Saudi Arabia as well. So and those are the three largest players. If you get those three on board with this, then this thing really just kind of takes off. But he also referenced something that maybe wasn't noticed so much was he was talking about all these places where they would live, which I'm not going to call them refugee camps because refugee assumes that they will be going back at some point. But he's talking about these places where they would move to and talked about Middle East investment. And that might have been a nod to Saudi Arabia to say that maybe Saudi Arabia has quietly had discussions about if this were to come about, maybe they could put money up. Yeah, as you may recall, Saudi Arabia has a plan that was really something out of almost science fiction. This massive city that they were going to build
Sure.
right on the border of Jordan and Saudi Arabia. This huge, long rectangular thing that shoots back several miles, and it really is just it's a stunning thing to see in terms of the arts rendition. The question I always had was, who's going to be there? Well, this might be some of that thought. And the Saudis do think big. When they think of doing stuff, they think very, very big in terms of real estate development. So I can't rule out that there's some thought. What I can tell you, though, is having spent time in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, a number
I mean,
of
how will they respond to what was just said there at this press conference, those states there in the region? I mean, what do you think they're thinking right now?
They don't want more Palestinian refugees. That's I can tell you that. I imagine that if I was in
No, but
Kuwait,
about
they'd
what
say,
he
no, we
said
don't
about
want
the
any more
United States'
Palestinian
role,
refugees.
about the United States' role, Hal, that is entirely new.
That's a head scratcher. I imagine at this point, unless there was some heads up given to them, they're walking away going, "We've never heard this before.
Okay.
That's never been discussed." I mean, the discussion up to this point had been that and I was almost slow walked in. Is you kind of heard, hey, the place is devastated, nobody can live there, and there were some real strong truths there, which is, look, the buildings, which I thought was very interesting. It was kind of a real estate sort of appraisal thing, which is the buildings are destroyed, and even the buildings that aren't completely destroyed, they're unstable, they'll collapse, and that's true. A lot of those buildings that are standing, they're not safe. It's not safe for people to move back into. The other thing you brought up was sanitation, which is that's something that occasionally makes the news, but not probably as much as it would. Lack of clean water, lack of any sewage system to speak of. In many ways, it is simply it's uninhabitable in most of Gaza, and so that's a huge problem. So there was going to have to be something on a major scale to happen anyway, just to get people to live on a reasonable way. But I got to tell you, for the countries around there, I imagine at first you're going to see a little bit of pushback from a number of countries, but with some of these things that President Trump has put out there, he throws it out there. There's pushback, and then for some reason it seems to take hold,
Yeah.
and so it may become the proposal du jour, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, Hal, it's so interesting because obviously right now it's entirely theoretical and hypothetical here. The war is still going on, although there is a ceasefire in place. He was asked whether or not he's confident the ceasefire will hold. He said we'll just have to wait and see. And it is holding, and more hostages are being released, and that's good news. But right now we're talking about something kind of purely hypothetical, even though, Hal, that President Trump just kind of floated it out there and then doubled down on it repeatedly when asked about it. But I want to ask, and this is somewhat of a political question. We have a live picture there outside the White House. You can see a pro-Palestinian demonstration. You see some Palestinian flags and the traditional headscarf, the keffiyeh there, worn by many of these demonstrators. How the political question, lastly, I want to go to is, for those supporters of the president, for those who voted for him in the last election, when he made promises that he did not want to expand the footprint of the United States in foreign lands, i.e. start new wars or gain new territories, what do you think they're thinking, especially with all the talk about Greenland and the talk about retaking back control of the Panama Canal, and now this latest idea of the United States having a presence and a role in rebuilding Gaza, the Gaza Strip, without Palestinians, apparently. He said anyone can come in. What do you think his supporters are saying who voted for him, who didn't want an expansion of that U.S. footprint on the world stage?
Some of them have to be kind of wondering, because this puts the U.S. in a sovereign territorial way in a part of the world we've never been before. We have been over in the Middle East a lot. You know, I've been over the Middle East quite a bit. All right, and certainly we have fought a number of wars, very long duration wars throughout the Middle East, Central Asia. But this actually puts us as a stakeholder, if you will, owning a key piece of terrain in what is a very volatile region. It is really, and when you add on to this, you know, the Greenland proposal, you know, the sort of, I don't know if you want to say trolling Canada to be the 51st state or something like that. And then you talk about taking back the Panama Canal. I'm sure some of his supporters are wondering, this is like a new manifest destiny in terms of where the U.S. is going in terms of acquiring new territory. It's big. You know, it's interesting. Sometimes I've heard the expression of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and what China does. They said, if you really want to understand it, go back and look at the British Empire in the 18th century. And they said all of a sudden things will become clear. I'm starting to look at this and say this does have certain manifestations of what the British Empire used to do, taking a foothold in a key area, not taking the whole area, but taking a foothold in a key area where they could extend their influence. And for the U.S., it really is. It's fascinating. You know, we're one of the things strategically, militarily, Iraq is problematic. Iraq, we have a presence there, but the government is predominantly Shiite. They lean towards their relationship with Iran. And even though we have basing rights there and we have a very large base that I've spent some time at, that we've used for a number of things, that probably won't last forever.
Okay.
And we probably got to look for another footprint in the Middle East. And so this opens up another footprint opportunity that probably wasn't there before. So again, it's very preliminary. I'm just kind of throwing things out there because, frankly, I'm still kind of trying to absorb what the president has just proposed.
So, Hal, I just wanted to ask you lastly, I mean, now that Netanyahu is there and he was speaking alongside the president, I mean, what is he going to say behind the scenes to Trump about that very idea? Because you and I, throughout the duration of this war, have talked about the day after, what's going to happen with the Gaza Strip. any role for the United States has never been brought up. It was always about whether or not Hamas would be there in some capacity, the Palestinian Authority, other states in the Middle East, whether Israel would have some type of role. Never the United States. Do you think Netanyahu is going to talk to him about this idea? He and his advisors, do you think they'll throw cold water on it? Do you think they'll try to talk him out of it? Or do you think that he will take the idea and move forward with it and want to work together with Trump on it? Or will he dismiss it outright?
I think Netanyahu, well, he said from the press conference, he seemed to be somewhat in concurrence with it, from what I can gather. The interesting thing is, it solves a lot of problems. You know, the issue was, look, the Arab countries in the Middle East were not thrilled with the idea of putting peacekeeping forces into Gaza. After that had never been met with any great reception, from what I could gather. All right, and certainly having IDF Israeli troops remaining in Gaza was going to be very problematic. And that was something that was being negotiated out. Now we're looking at something completely different. You know, the Arab countries say, well, that's great. We don't have to put our troops in harm's way, dealing with the problem of a resurgent Hamas trying to reestablish itself in the Gaza Strip. Solves a problem for them on the one hand. The other problem, though, of course, is they're going to have to house or put up some sort of thing to keep Palestinians on their own territory. That's another issue. But it does solve that problem, and it solves a problem for Israel in that they have a very reliable security presence in Gaza, one that they can say, look, we're absolutely sure that they're not going to let a resurgent Hamas or PIJ or anything else attack Israel from the Gaza Strip. So in that regard, it solves a lot of problems. Although, as we've discussed, it creates other issues that are going to take a long time to resolve and to work through and negotiate.
All right, Hal Kempfer, as always, we can't thank you enough. We were going to talk to you a little bit later on tonight about not only this press conference, but also Secretary of State Marco Rubio's trip to Central America, which you and I have discussed offline, which has somewhat yielded some results here, both in Panama and also El Salvador. We'll get to that another time, Hal. Can't thank you enough, but of course, preempted by news that Trump makes. That seems to be the theme in the last 3 weeks here. Hal, good to see you.
Good to see you, Andrew.